Okay, it is 6 p.m. Let's call to order the December 19th meeting of the Westfield Redevelopment Commission. John, take roll, please.
Linda Nuss.
Here.
Bob Beaudry. Here. Jill Doyle.
Here.
Doug Holtz.
Here.
Joe Plankus.
Here.
Mike Steele.
Here. Okay, we have a quorum. All 5 commission members are here, along with Mike. I have one change to our agenda that we need to do here first. The Gaylord Electric use agreement has been taken off and will be handled at our January meeting. Next item on the agenda is the approval of the Redevelopment Commission meeting minutes for November 21st. There is one correction at the top. Jill Doyle was here, so we need to add Jill to the attendees for that meeting. Marla, if you would, please. I don't know of any other changes necessary. Do we have any comments or questions from the commission members about the accuracy of the minutes? Okay, hearing none, do I have a motion for approval?
So moved.
Okay, motion Doug Holtz. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Okay, second Bob Beaudry. Thank you, Bob. All in favor, please signify by saying aye. John, take
Joe
roll,
Plankus.
please.
Joe Plankus.
Yes.
Doug Holtz.
Aye.
Jill Doyle.
Aye.
Bob Beaudry.
Yes.
Linda Nuss.
Aye.
Okay, minutes approved. Thank you very much. Next item is approval of claims. Cam, I'm going to turn this one over to you to get us started.
Yeah, and I received some questions from Commissioner Nass earlier this afternoon, and so I'm glad to walk through responses of those prior to the motion to approve claims. First, I know, as you've seen, we tracked Grand Park requests for proposals time separately in a separate matter. I think you had asked if there's any time or invoices from December of 21. I'm not aware of any, so I think you have everything that's there in coded in pink before you. And I would say, as to the process, I think we'll be in a good position to give a more substantive update in the first quarter of next year. The review committee has been convened, has met several times. That consists of members of the community, Councilor Patton from the City Council. They've reviewed the responses received to the RFP. We are in the process now of setting up interviews and meetings with each of the individual respondents for January and February of next year. We hope to this week have that those scheduled and finalized. And there will certainly be Redevelopment Commission involvement. You're ultimately the decision maker, at least as to the field portion. Of course, GPEC would need to be referred to the City Council, but that committee has been convened to review those things to help advise the process to then bring in the ultimate decision maker, which is the Redevelopment Commission, later to say, here's what we reviewed, here's the information, here's our recommendation to engage at that point. So we do anticipate that will occur following the interviews, so probably towards second quarter of next year. But again, glad to get things in place for a more complete update. That's what I know as I sit here, more complete update in the first of next year. And we'll continue to keep that time tracked separately, et cetera. And let's see. There's a question about legal invoices from December 2020 through November 2021. I don't have a breakdown of that. As you've seen, we have a Redevelopment Commission matter. That's our term for how we track time. And I've always put my time there. How that has been paid in the past, I can't speak to. I've not seen that. I've not been involved in this kind of a process in the past here. But that's how I've always put my time to that matter. So I'm not sure that period of time how that was processed. There was a question about Catherine Finello's time. Of course, she's an attorney at a different firm who has done some bond work for the city, for the Redevelopment Commission. Hers has been billed separately. Her time has been paid most recently out of bond proceeds for the Union Square bonds. And that is typical related to a subsequent question. If we've got bonds coming up, that time is typically tracked in a separate matter and paid as part of cost of issuance or at least out of proceeds at the closing of those bonds. So we do track that in detail for that purpose. And her time's already been paid. It's not billed through Taft. I think the suggestion about an operating fund is a good suggestion. I think we could take that up in next year. As you know, the tax abatements that are part of the incentives toolbox for the city are handled by the city council as a designating body. So it would take some coordination there. If we wanted to incorporate a fee that's provided for in statute, that would have to be part of the negotiation and the approval at the council level. There's a process by which a portion of those tax abatement savings can be remitted to the Redevelopment Commission or another economic development or redevelopment entity and used. I've seen them certainly used often as operating costs of the Redevelopment Commission. Sometimes they go to fund other local, like nonprofit economic development corporation type items. But I think that's certainly a topic of discussion that would involve the council and city staff, but something I've certainly seen work well in other communities. So, good
Can I ask a
suggestion there,
question
too.
of John? So my question would be, how are we going to fund these claims? I mean, I don't have a problem. I think, Taft deserves to get paid for their services, but are we talking about paying for it out of TIF funds?
Yes.
Because,
These bills that were sent that are on the docket tonight, is that what you're asking?
yeah.
Yes.
So, and then I can kick this back to Cam. So it's my understanding, it's my understanding that in order for us to pay any kind of bills out of the RDC, that has to come from an operating fund that's appropriated by the council, which hasn't been happening in the past, hasn't been happening. But I kind of feel like they kind of kicked it down the road to us to push this through when really it's the council's obligation to appropriate these funds. You can't really TIF funds are taxpayer funds. They're not city funds. I know people have referenced them being city funds, but they're taxpayer money. So in your legal opinion, Cam, shouldn't that be the way it works? Shouldn't the council appropriate an operating fund for the RDC, and then the RDC can vote to appropriate those funds to the claims as they come across instead of using TIF monies that technically are taxpayer dollars?
That is our way. That it could be done through an operating fund. I would say.
Is that Indiana code?
And really, well, I think you have another option, which is I think what we're considering this evening,
Okay.
which is, and really keeping in mind that all the city funds are taxpayer dollars by and large, so it's a matter of accounting. How do you account for services? Professional services, like legal services, like municipal advisor services, can be paid out of allocation funds of captured incremental property tax revenues. And that is how I think they're being presented, hence the exercise that coded which services relate to which area. I think we've talked about serve and benefit.
Right.
In my view, as I talked about a little bit last month, there's a little bit different way to look at services relative to infrastructure expenditures, but we have undertaken the exercise to go through the time and categorize the services that were rendered into allocation areas that were served or benefited by those services. And I do think that is completely consistent with the code to pay for those services out of those allocation funds. What you're talking about is an operating fund from other revenues. Of course, operation costs, as a defined term, can't be paid from TIF revenues, but an operating fund could fund those. That could be set up. That's just another way that you could handle things.
So you're saying there's different ways
works
to
either
do it?
way, yes.
And is that per Indiana code, or is that a legal opinion?
I'm not sure I understand the just a legal opinion is simply applying the Indiana code or case
Interpretation,
law
right.
to a particular set of facts.
I understand.
So it's really both, yes.
Okay.
So, yeah, I think the way that they've been presented this evening, just to summarize, is as professional services which have served and or benefited particular allocation areas, and hence the coding that we have done to break that time into particular chunks that relate to those different allocation areas, which is a legal way to process these claims. They could also be paid out of an operating fund if you had one.
Okay, I think, Jeremy, you've got a couple comments that you want to make in regards to this.
I don't think I do, actually. Y'all covered it pretty well. One clarification that I would make is on the operating fund. And it's partially a question for Cam, too. So the operating fund would require council to approve an operating fund, and then monies from lit or property tax or food and beverage would be moved into that fund for the RDC to then control for operation costs. When I think of operations costs, I'm thinking salaries, benefits of an employee, things like that. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it's a good distinction. Those are certainly operating costs. And if it is a stream of revenue, if you will, that is part of the provenance of the council as the fiscal body for the city, then yes, the council would have to appropriate those funds into an operating fund to be used for redevelopment commission operations. Yeah.
So other than that, unless you all have questions for me, I don't have any. I will verify that Taft has performed all these services that they've invoiced for. They've been asked to do that work. They performed it very well. We owe them payment for their services, and John has done a nice job of breaking down right here on the docket sheet of where these funds would come from based on the work that Cam has put together. One set would come from the East Side TIF, and the other would come from the Grand Junction TIF. And
I do have a question for you, Jeremy. You know, the city council approved the $400,000 appropriation for the RDC to pay for legal fees for 2022.
They did not.
Huh?
They did not. Well, they actually did approve it, but based on I guess, an informal veto, an unintentional veto, the mayor never signed that paper, that ordinance in the 10-day period, so it becomes per statute a pocket veto. So that ordinance is null. That said, I don't believe anything we're doing here is outside of what we are allowed to do.
Okay, so there were certain claims that were paid for Taft for RDC business that the city council approved for the first portion of the year because it was coming out of administrative funds.
That's correct. There's roughly $145,000 worth of RDC business, which you'll see in what Cam has put together. Everything up and into May.
Yeah,
was
May
paid
4th.
for by the city council with property tax dollars. with
Okay,
general fund
so
dollars.
for clarification, so you gave us a 6-page summary, and obviously there's detail in those other spreadsheets as to the breakdown of what went onto these 6 pages, which totals about $162,000. And that is for us to approve because that will be coming out of TIF funds to pay those legal expenses.
That is
That a
correct.
correct
There's a-
statement?
That is a correct statement, specifically on the docket sheet, which you should all have in your packet. I believe it's the 4th page you'll see there. On that cover sheet there, it gives you the total of $162,351.79, broken out with the appropriate invoice numbers, which should align with the invoices behind you, and the TIFs that it is coming from. You have East Side TIF for the first 3 invoices, Grand Junction TIF for the second 3 invoices, and then a sum total at the bottom. John did in the middle column there, middle-ish column, you see a highlighted box with a 1, 4, 6, 2, 3, and 5. Those tie directly to the numbers on the corresponding invoices. So the first one that you see, right down by the total of invoice number 1, invoice 4043239, you'll see a 1 by the $15,963.50 invoice total. If you reference back to the docket sheet, the 1 aligns with that same amount.
Hey, Jeremy, just a quick question. And because you've been in the executive director role for a fairly brief time, but have you or would you consider going before the council before next year and requesting that they appropriate an operating fund so that we can do this per IC without any ambiguities? I mean, would that be something you'd be considering?
don't know that there's an opportunity to do it, or it's necessary to do it before the end of the year.
No, I meant for next year.
Yeah, so sometime in '23,
Yeah.
if we determine that we need to, what operating dollars, what are we using the operating funds for?
Well, to pay bills out of that. So it's my understanding under Indiana code, and I know Linda's gonna probably want to touch base on this more so, because she knows a lot more about than I do. But we listened to, I listened to a phone conversation that she had with Lori with the State Board of Accounting.
Yeah, I listened to it.
Okay, so according to her, TIF funds are meant to be spent in that specific TIF. They're not really intended to be used across the board to fund other projects in different TIF areas. Because as she described it, they're taxpayer dollars, they're not city dollars. So when you do that and you have a carry forward and you create a fund on your own, you're really depriving the taxpayers in that specific TIF area of the benefits they receive from that TIF and the fact that it's meeting its needs, and anything beyond that should be considered for pass-through to taxing entities that benefit from those. So in my impression from listening to that phone conversation, we've been operating way outside the scope of how we should be, because it's always been considered in the past that these are city dollars that we can just use for whatever, you guys deem as appropriate. I don't agree with that. I mean, I just don't.
Two things. One, I've also listened to the call. I think that's a mischaracterization of the conversation. And two, I would say, hence the exercise here, which, as Lori made clear in that call, to the extent that professional services serve or benefit a particular allocation area, which is why we've broken these out accordingly, those fees can be paid as expenditures from that allocation fund, no problem. So that's why we've done this exercise, and that's how it's presented as claims for you this evening, is per allocation area based on the serve or benefit of that allocation area. And the distinction between city funds and taxpayer dollars is illusory. That doesn't make any sense.
Not according to them. And here's the thing, like when you have TIF areas that have no funds, that's where the operating fund would come into play, because that's where the council appropriates money, city monies, to help get these TIFs going until they generate some revenue, okay? And when I hear the word illegal and outside of the scope, I don't think I mischaracterize that. I mean, that was pretty specific. I mean, I consider myself a fairly intelligent person, and I listened to it, and that's exactly what the words that Lori used. So, I mean, I guess if you didn't interpret that way, we have a different interpretation, but I'm just trying to say, I think that these fees need to be paid. If you did the work, yes. I think that's council's obligation. They kicked it to us, and it's not technically the way it should roll. And so that's where my problem lies. I think they should deal with it. We're the RDC. We're not the, fiscal body of the city. That's where I'm coming from. And I mean, we could argue it all night. I'm not gonna, I mean, that's just my
I
opinion.
don't know that there's a need to argue. I think the characterization that the way they're presented for consideration this evening, for approval that you can all vote on as approved, is not at all illegal. And there was nothing in the State Board of Accounts that indicates that. In fact, she's very clear that there would be no audit finding or anything if you were to approve professional services that serve or benefit a particular allocation area. And that's how we have separated these things out, and that's how they've been presented for vote this evening. So how it's been done in the past, I won't speak to, don't speak to. I don't have good knowledge about a lot of that. Moving forward, I think this presents a way for things to be paid in a specific and clear fashion, and I think it will dictate how we record time so that we're clear about which allocation area, without having to go back and forensically redo this. Moving forward, I think every entry would speak to that. However, an operating fund that could allow for payment of services that are, in areas that don't have money, et cetera, is perfectly fine, and I'd be glad to work with city staff, with the council, with whoever to set that up. But I think, again, as these services were rendered, received, and serve or benefit the allocation areas that we've identified, they're perfectly legal, and there's nothing in the State Board of Accounts recall that it would indicate otherwise.
Right. And I'm not disagreeing with that at all. I'm just saying, and I'd like to see us get the train on the track here and do it the way it was maybe intended. That's all I'm
So
saying.
two things that I'll add to this, and hopefully it'll help
I
explain.
told you we didn't need to fight about anything.
What's that?
Two things that I'll add that hopefully will help. For the 2023 budget, there will be legal lines in the different allocation areas. So services that are generated from that TIF district will be paid by that TIF district, not different than what we have here. And secondly is the intention of this entire process of moving legal fees over here is because in general fund, this is how we pay for the operations of the city, right? So if you've got $162,000 worth of legal fees that are generated by the RDC, which cannot be used to pay for police officers or firefighters or plow your roads, moving those off the general fund into where they're appropriately should be paid, frees up $162,000 worth of operating revenue in the general fund.
Right.
So that's the ultimate goal of all of this. It's all taxpayer dollars, all of it. Let's put this money here and use it how it was intended and free up enough money to pay for at least one, if not two police officers in the general fund.
I have some questions.
Let me just say.
Go ahead.
Let me ask him. This obviously with the 162 and all of the machinations going on with the ordinance for the appropriation of 400,000, and obviously that's off the table. This is a one-time deal because going forward, we will budget in our yearly budget, starting with 23. Obviously, 22 has to be modified to accommodate the 162 and any other legal expenses that come up before the end of the year. But the 23 budget has to be modified for us to take into account that we now have to pay the legal fees for all activities generated, bills generated by the RDC.
Correct. And
And that requires only our action, not an action by the city council.
that's correct. They have review authority and they'll get that opportunity.
That's correct,
The
once the
RDC will
budget's
be-
submitted to them, absolutely.
So
That's
just to be,
also considering that we carry TIF balances, which I know we do that, but technically we shouldn't be doing. We shouldn't be.
No, you have to have the TIF balances, Bob, if you're gonna pay your bills, if you're gonna pay your bonds, and if there's an economic development opportunity that comes forward that may require a couple $1 million, we have to have the money in those funds.
Well, I know
That's
what
how
I'm
we
saying
have-
is.
That's how this RDC is supposed to function.
No, that's not how it's supposed to
exactly
function.
what Indiana code says.
That's not how it's supposed to function, Joe. I'm sorry, but when a TIF meets its obligations, the additional should be passed through to the taxing entities like schools, public libraries, things that have a need for those tax dollars. If a need comes up that's where the operating fund that the council appropriates comes into play. They appropriate the money, we have an operating fund, and we can pay bills, and maybe if they anticipate a project, or Jeremy goes to them and say, hey, we really think we have a couple projects that are gonna warrant some funding, they appropriate that money. And as far as I'm concerned, they make year-end appropriations for funds that are over budget, which I know it happens all the time. They could do that here with this too. That's my opinion. I think the bills need to be paid, but I think that it's council's obligation, not ours. We're not operating the way Indiana code specifies we should be operating, and that's where my problem lies, and I will leave it lie at that.
Cam?
Nothing further.
Okay, Linda?
Yeah, one simple question. When you said you had no other invoices, there were no November invoices for the Grand Park RFP, the pink-coded ones? Because it went from January to October, and you're saying there aren't any from December and there aren't any from November?
No, November of 2022.
Yes, 2022.
I think November and December invoices were just sent to Jeremy today. I mean, we're just totaling
Okay.
out the month.
yes, I received November invoices today
For the Grand Park RFP.
for the RDC in general.
Well, we had the November ones on the others.
Okay.
Yeah, I had two
Those are on
invoices for the RDC, and I don't have them committed to memory at this
This
point
goes
in
through
time.
November 30th. This one just went through October. So I'm just clarifying, are there more to come? And
There's
you're
not
saying-
more to come this year. Those will move into the next year because I didn't get them till today.
Because we didn't get 'em
I wasn't
till
going to put them
November.
on this docket last minute and further this conversation.
Okay, just wanted to clarify that question. Thank you. The other thing is that last year, this body did not vote a budget at all, because we had the meeting and I asked, do we have to vote on this budget, and was told no, and that's on the audio, you can all listen to that. So we didn't actually vote a budget last year, as far as this body goes. In going through this whole process, we were not anticipating in this year these type of legal fees for a Grand Park sale. Now, we started incurring those on January 4th of 2022, but we were not made aware, because we didn't get these invoices, that this was happening as of January. The RFP went out in March. There was no resolution where the RDC began that process, but there were legal bills being incurred that we now are being told we're responsible for. But as a body, we never approved that, never set up a budget, never anticipated a budget, and I am told by more than one person at the SBOA and AIM, talk to them, they have lawyers, that in fact, this is not the intent of TIF funds, to pay these kind of legal fees. Now, these legal fees could be reimbursed out of a sale if a sale materializes from Grand Park, okay, a reimbursement. Normally, what is accepted as legal expenses in a TIF fund are the legal expenses and like the Crone expenses too, those services, TIF services, where you're anticipating an EDA, you're setting up a TIF district, you're setting up a bond, you create a plan, you now have a bond, and those can go into issuance costs. So although they question where if it should even go into the TIF account when we pay them, they're kind of, yeah, we might let that go by. But honestly, they don't see it that way. They see it that those should be coming out of an operating fund. Other cities throughout the state have operating funds in varying amounts. Greenwood has 30-some thousand, Noblesville has 200,000, but for this, and these receipts that you gave us, all these, actually total up to, the pinks are $145,144. The other ones with the multiple districts is $108,300.50. So that's $253,444.50. I did not have this claims form till tonight at the meeting, so I didn't even know what number was going to be on here. We just got this now. But it doesn't match up to 162. So I don't know if anyone can quickly explain why those don't add up to these. But again, when you go back to this whole process of this sale, and who was authorizing all these legal costs, because they've turned out to be considerable, and it isn't that we just found out, because I think for a couple months everybody's been playing with what are we going to do with these legal fees, where are we going to pay these legal fees, and other lawyers and SBOA think that it's not appropriate to bring it out of a TIF fund, because TIF funds, if you read in the Indiana code, it says here's the uses of TIF funds, and then it very specifically
I've read
says,
the code. I don't
well,
need, you can vote accordingly.
yeah,
I don't
but
need
it
your.
says not operating expenses. Well, I'm not saying it just for you. I'm just
Yeah,
telling.
we've analyzed those. We've
Okay.
determined they're not operating costs. They're
Fine.
professional services that serve or benefit the allocation area that's been identified.
Well,
I'll say it
a lot
again.
of money coming out of the TIF funds. The other thing is, I did ask for the legal contract. I got the letter of engagement from January 5th, where all it said about fees was the city agrees to pay Taft a monthly payment of $20,000 for the representation. And I do understand non-retainer. I get that. I've been in business. I've dealt with lawyers way too long. Many, many experiences. So the question is, we didn't get anything new in 2022. I know on this sale of the Grand Park, RFP, let's call it the RFP, there have been 16 different attorneys and paralegals, a couple paralegals, but 16 different attorneys working on this. And I also noticed that some of the attorney fees have increased from 2021 to 2022. Does that not affect your retainer fee? I'm just asking, because clearly $50 an hour more is a lot more for quote, non-retainer.
Yeah, it doesn't.
Non-retainer?
The retainer covers a certain scope of services, and then there are things that are outside of that amount. per month covers the meetings. That's why we've apportioned even the RDC meetings as orange in your spreadsheet as part of the retainer. So that hasn't increased, even as the
Okay.
fees have for special projects. And I think moving forward, there has been a discussion of separating out, and renewing engagements and separating one out for the redevelopment commission that would be under a not to exceed, and one for the city, civil city, and that work under a separate not to exceed. So that should be clarified. But in any event, the services that are outlined and detailed in the packet that you have been requested and rendered. So regardless of the engagement and the scope thereof, the Latin term is quantum meruit. They're owed.
Yes, yeah, I get that. Okay, so we're going to expect something different, but we didn't necessarily expect something at the beginning of 2022. And your engagement letter doesn't list, you know, rates, hourly rates of any of your staff or attorneys or whatever. It's a pretty simple engagement letter. It's not much compared to many I've seen over the years. But I guess, you know, the question is, here we are, we've got all these bills. I don't know who kept saying, hey, just keep doing this and keep doing that, and we haven't had many updates to know what's going on, but we're up to, by these invoices, $253,000. I don't know where the balance of that is when I'm only asked tonight to vote on $162,000, but I would like to take time, now that I have that, and try to reconcile this to it. But I honestly think we're doing this because the accounts in general, 1330 and 1331, went way over budget this year, so we've got to find somewhere to pay this. I just don't think between January of this year until the last 2 or 3 months did we know this, although the 1330 and 1331 were over budget months ago.
Are you talking about the general fund budget?
Yes, I am talking about
Yeah,
the
it's all
general
been
fund.
reconciled or will be with existing funds without having to do an additional appropriation. Certainly not relevant to what is happening here, and certainly not relevant to why we are trying to move legal fees to the RDC.
Okay, with that being said, I'm open for motion. Any other commissioners want to make any comments regards to this item?
Well, I'd like to make a comment just on behalf of the clerk treasurer, if I could. We have not received these claims, our office. And to be clear, we did request all of the claims for the entire year, which we had never gotten back until recently. Last week, we got an email that included all the claims. But ultimately, it's the fiscal officer's signature that's required on your top copy. She has to be able to audit them, and she has to be able to certify them. And if she hasn't seen them, even with your approval, she can't and won't do it. I'm not sure why she should be left out of the loop. I'm her representative here tonight. I checked all day long. We'd gotten no email with any of the claims on them. Our office hasn't been involved in the process. So you're welcome to go ahead and approve them, but understand that if she doesn't have them, she's not going to certify them because she can't audit them.
What part doesn't she have? Just this top sheet?
Any of it.
I emailed her and everyone exactly what I emailed the RDC, the invoices and the supporting documentation.
When?
I don't recall when.
Well, I checked with her as late as 2:30 before I left the office, and I spoke with her again this evening, and she's not received anything ever.
Okay, well, I'll verify, and if not, I'll be sure to send the same email. We're not hiding anything from anyone. It's got to come to you. We recognize that.
Right.
And
You know, I
keep in
think
mind,
that-
everybody, we are working on this process to make it meet your needs.
Absolutely.
That's the goal.
Right.
You have to allow us to take the first step before we can take the second step.
Well, claims is kind of an old step.
I don't disagree. I can't fix what happened yesterday.
Right.
I can only fix tomorrow.
Totally agreed. So she wanted me to let you know, because it is by code, that she has to sign them, and they've never made it back to her this year.
So the code isn't new, and I don't think
Right.
it's been a problem. I don't think she's had a problem signing all these things in the past.
She hasn't signed them because we never got them back until this week.
Over the last 20 years, she's never signed these.
Oh, gee.
Oh, in the last year, she's never signed them.
Okay.
They've never made it back to her until this week.
Again, another thing we have to fix.
Absolutely.
I guess the message I would want you to bring back to Cindy, Marla, is if she's got an issue, she's a chief financial officer, she needs to take the initiative and reach out to Jeremy or me. I have never gotten a message from her on anything that's amiss. So we're done with that subject, we're moving on. I make a motion that we approve the claims for TAF for $162,000 and change. Do I have a second on that motion?
Yeah, somebody other than the president should move for approval.
Okay.
Yeah,
Do I have,
thank you.
do I have a motion for approval of claims?
I make a motion to approve the claims.
Okay, motion by Jill Doyle. I have a second.
Second.
Second, John, we have a motion on the floor. Please take a roll.
Joe Plankus,
Aye.
Doug Holtz,
Aye.
Jill Doyle,
Aye.
Bob Bodray,
No.
Linda Knopf.
No.
Motion passes 3-2. On to the next subject. Mr. Dalton, step forward if you would, sir, and give us some more good news here.
Little preface, if I could. Just as you saw in my email, I trust that the amended standby land transfer agreement does include a term that requires the Redevelopment Commission to consent to the sale of any land that's subject to that agreement. We've done this before with the library. I trust you saw that, but just to remind you all again, that's what this is. It's a visibility check, as I see it, in terms of the term of the contract.
Awareness
Allows
item.
you to see the progress, so.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Kim. Birch.
I got an idea on the legal fees. We can just extend the hunting, attorney hunting season all year round instead of just 30 days. Just kind of kidding, Cam.
We didn't ask you.
So where we're at, we have another lot prepared for sale in the next couple of weeks. It's lot number 3. I believe John Rogers handed this out to you.
I pass it around to everybody, Birch. I don't know, if John's got it also in the packet.
Okay, and then you'll see on the survey or on the plat, it's lot 3. Lot 1 is the library. Lot 2 was part of the library transferred to Danny Moyer, and Lot 3 is the medical office building. Quick update, well, we have our pre-con meeting tomorrow, so the roads, the storm, and utilities can start anytime after tomorrow morning, which our first deadline's January 15th to get the pond in and the storm in for the library. I don't know if you've been down off of Westfield Boulevard, but we've cleared the buildings, we've cleaned up the environmental, and the library has their construction fence up and their office there, so they're starting right behind us as they get approval. So I'm here today to answer any questions on Lot 3, the sell the MOB. I think on the finances, it makes a big step. After this sale, we'll only have about $1.6 million to $1.7 million left with the senior first mortgage holder. And then thereafter, we pay that off. The rest of the money goes to pay down the Community First Bank. Now, the headwinds, I mean, obviously, you all watch TV, and you feel the interest rates. Interest rate carry on this loan has went from $28,000 a month to $60,000 a month. So obviously, you know, the Biden plan's not helping this one, but I think we'll be fine. We have 2 other sales in the hopper, around $5-6 million, and we're negotiating on 1 big land sale on the Haypick. It's a major development, way too early to discuss, but I think by 2024, we'll have the decks clean on this one pretty well. I mean, I think with the library and this MOB going in, it's really kick-started the project. So is there any questions anybody has on this?
Okay, hearing none. Thank you very much, Birch. I'm open for a motion for consent for disposition of the land request as per the standby land transfer agreement.
So moved?
Okay, I have a motion. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Bob Bodry for a second. Thank you. All in favor, please signify by saying aye. John, please take the roll.
Linda Knopf,
Aye.
Bob Bodray,
Aye.
Jill Doyle,
Aye.
Doug Holtz,
Aye.
Joe Plankus.
Aye. Motion passes 5-0. Thank you, Birch. Go on to your next meeting. Okay, Grand Park user agreements. Matt?
Good evening, commission members. Matt Trinian for the record, Grand Park. Before you is this next set of ratification of use agreements and a few sponsor agreements for Grand Park. I did send these out about 2 weeks ago. I did not receive any questions, but happy to take any questions you may have in regards to the agreements that are.
I'm still
up
reading
for
the
today.
334 pages, man.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
A lot of repeat, but very important that we get those in your hands.
Okay, any questions from commission members for Matt? Okay, pretty standard monthly process. I have a motion for approval.
I so move.
Okay, motion by Linda Noss, second.
Second.
Doug Holtz. All in favor, please signify by saying aye. John, take the roll, please.
Joe Plankus,
Aye?
Doug Holtz,
Aye.
Jill Doyle,
Aye.
Bob Bodray,
Aye.
Linda Noss.
Aye.
Okay, motion passes. Thank you very much. Matt, next item is Colts Training Camp recap.
Yes, again, Matt Trinian before you. Found it to be very important to kind of put a bow on 2022 and make sure that we reported on this past year's training camp. Unfortunately, the great training camp that we had in late July and all of August has not translated to the many wins that we would have wished, but I know that through our recap meetings, all felt like it was a very successful camp. But I'll share today some notes regarding 2022. In doing so, I wanted to make sure that we just kind of recap the relationship as a whole. So this past year was our fourth camp. We've had different iterations of practice times, indoor versus outdoor. What we found in 2022 is we were able to settle in on an afternoon-heavy practice load, which allowed us to see an increase in attendance from 21 and saw more revenues come in from a lunch side of things, as many of the practices were tied to the lunch timeline. In 2022, it's also important to note that we actually brought in additional food vendors to support the visitor experience that we were looking to increase, along with bringing in the Detroit Lions. So again, with our relationship with the Colts, it's been great to have a supporting team come in every year and have a unique fan base. And with Detroit's fan base being so close, those were pretty heavily attended dates.
Yeah, let me just throw a comment out, Matt. You would appreciate this. Of course, I worked GPEC, as you know, during the Colts camp. And when the Lions came in the first time and walked in, the guy just kind of stood around and looked and he says, I won't repeat what he said. I'll just say, holy cow. He says, we got to have one of these. So he was just awestruck by the facility that the Colts are able to use with GPEC and in the fields and everything that goes along with it. So compliments to the staff for treating those guys really well.
Yeah, we've been blessed to work with, again, these four teams. And actually, I think I mentioned in a previous meeting or maybe earlier this year, but we also hosted Tennessee a few years back for a practice ahead
And
of
Georgia
and,
for the championship.
and Georgia. So we've been privy to have some pretty notable programs come through. One thing to note here as well, as I know it kind of came up through one of our dialogues via email, practice times, I want to make sure that I hit on that. Again, we had a lot of success in 22 with having the majority of the practices in the afternoon. That is a decision that is really solely driven by the head coach of the team as they kind of set their plan for the season. There's a heavy input from our staff with the Colts front office, and we had a lot of buy-in from the Colts front office to move a lot of practices to the afternoon. From a team perspective, you're dealing with warmer time frames. A lot of the practices traditionally are in the morning to keep the players cooler and stay out of the sun, but a lot of buy-in from the whole organization to shift practices to the afternoon to have a better draw of attendance. So I want to make sure that I point that out, and we anticipate with the new coach in 23 that may look a little different, but we'll work through that process, and I'm excited to see what that brings. This is a really neat map that the Colts produced and shared with us. This is a zip code map for Indiana, and it really just shows the draw of where we saw folks just from the state. We did see folks from outside of the state, but this map and iteration is just for the state of Indiana. Obviously, a high density right around Hamilton County and supporting areas, but really neat to see we stretched, to the far northwest, to the far southwest corners of the state. Saw a lot of attendance, so really, really excited about that piece, and just knowing the impact that camp has on the statewide is really neat initiative. These few images I'd like to share. We had an event called Back Together Saturday that we shared alongside the Colts and all 32 NFL franchises as a whole. This was a NFL Network and NFL-driven weekend date where all 32 franchises were practicing at some portion of the day. We were fortunate enough to have an evening practice that night. We saw large crowds, as you can see. NFL Network actually did a live broadcast from Grand Park, and we got a lot of TV coverage from that standpoint. So a lot of great notoriety there. They did on-field interviews with players as they're practicing. Hopefully it wasn't too much of a distraction, but really neat initiative, and you can really see how the setup of that location was really transformed to fit that level of attendance in one day. Oh, it's also important to note that Officer Caden from Westfield PD actually took these drone photos for our use, so really neat to really showcase. Again, I always preach this, that Colts Camp is much larger than a Grand Park event. This is a community-wide event, and all of the various departments within the city of Westfield play a huge role in being able to pull this off. I just have the pleasure of being able to speak to you guys about it, but really neat initiative how Caden was able to take his drone up, get these really neat photos, and we can use them for marketing purposes. So shout out to Caden and Westfield PD for that. It is also important to note that this year's camp had about 4,200 seats, and you see all the little dots there, so we had about 4,200 people in the bleachers there, and then we had 10 suites upstairs. So that layout we envisioned to be a primarily strong one moving forward, and had a lot of success there. As we talk about the community, we couldn't have pulled camp off without the support from our wonderful volunteers. Westfield Welcome and Kayla Arnold and Bailey Spitznagel and their team did a great job of attracting volunteers for fan engagement, getting to drive players, being that friendly face to welcome folks to camp, checking people in at the front ticket gates. Really a great group to help share that Westfield way that we're all proud of. And then from a public safety standpoint, Joe, as you hit on it, there were 17 volunteers that covered safety shifts, whether it be monitoring the event center or helping be on-field support during practice time. So again, it's a huge community draw, and what a great initiative for these volunteers to help push how great camp can be. And we really couldn't have pulled camp off without these fine individuals. I also wanted to share just a year-over-year financial. As we look at 2022, from a revenue perspective, we did hit our $100,000 mark that is called out in the agreement from a revenue standpoint, from a concessions and parking standpoint. Was a lot of that was driven around parking revenues being fairly high due to the higher attendance, and then again, more food options that we saw increased revenues in from those various food vendors. From an expense standpoint, I think a lot of this is inflationary costs that you see. We as a staff are quite proud that we were able to manage expenses to a tune of only $10,000 increase from 21 to 22. It's important to note that within there's a lot of movement between the housing costs that we're responsible for, along with the bleacher costs and how we're able to manipulate those numbers to try and get that expense line as far down. We have some new strategies that we're looking to implement in 23, and I'll share those as we get those solidified, but really proud of the way that we were able to manage the expense line given the inflationary rates that we all saw in 2022. And then from a reimbursable standpoint, really, if you're looking at those numbers, you see there's quite a jump from 21 to 22. Really, the biggest jump came from the increase in bleacher costs. As we were evaluating bleachers, the first quote that we got nearly, more than doubled. So we went out to another vendor. Costs were about the same, but for a better product, we paid almost double from what we paid last year, or in 21, yeah. So from a reimbursable standpoint, that's why you see almost $100,000 uptick is because of primarily bleachers, and the Colts pay for half of those bleacher costs. So wanted to make sure I pointed those pieces out. But again, pretty strong year from our ability to manage our expenses within those inflationary rates increasing. I always feel it's important to point out that although, yes, we host training camp, I think it's important to look at the relationship as a whole. We have several other activities that we host outside of training camp, which includes, the Sunday night 7-on-7 league, Colts Junior Cheer, and so on and so forth. Two things happened during camp that were really neat. The Colts and Marvel had a press release where they had, I think, four specific games where they had a Marvel tie to it to really bring in the fun aspect of a new marketing wave. And they actually did that press release at camp early on. And then, as mentioned, when we hosted Detroit was the team selected this past year to be a part of HBO's Hard Knocks. Hard Knocks was on site for the 2 days of training camp, and there's some really neat video of Coach Dan Campbell coming out, the head coach for the Lions, and he had some select words of how cool it was to be at Grant Park, but the clip, he really is looking out at the fans and saying, wow, this is like a really neat venue to be able to do practice. And as we recapped with the Colts, they made comment that the Detroit staff said how they needed to have a camp like this that they could replicate in Detroit. So to hear that kind of envy from a team that shares the league was really neat. And then finally, there was a really neat initiative during camp. Actually, one of the first few days of camp was this girls' flag football clinic that the Colts ran that we were proud to be a part of and host on site as well. So really neat initiatives that the Colts bring to Grant Park on behalf of the relationship that we're able to help support. That really covers the recap for 2022. As mentioned, we eagerly await our ability to get and connect with them to continue planning 2023. Traditionally, in the cycle of things, we let them get through their season, let them debrief a little bit, and then get back into the planning stages for 23. We've had some great discussion post-camp in regards to how we think we can make things better for 23, but really feel like we left 22 with a strong output to not only Westfield residents, but Indiana citizens as a whole. So with that, I'll be happy to take any questions that you guys may have, and we'll go from there.
Anything you want to share that you're looking forward to or considering next year?
Yeah, I think I'll be purposefully
in case it
kind
doesn't
of bland here,
yeah.
but we're really looking at modeling our finances a little bit differently, especially from an expense standpoint, to benefit the park in a better way. There's certain expenses that, as we discussed with the Colts, that there may be better use for those dollars if they're spent a different way. That we may get more benefit out of as opposed to how they're currently used. So that's one way. Fan engagement is always super important. As we look at the Colts season, we really want to see success. But naturally, training camp is always that first look at the team. And if they continue to have poor results, they'll have a higher draft pick, which usually draws a little bit more attendance of seeing potentially a new quarterback or whatever it may be that may come. So all in all, there's a major push for fan engagement. This, from a Colts initiative, is much more than football. I mean, from a event side, they probably wouldn't say this, but they don't care about the product on the field more than they care about entertaining their fans with this subsidiary activation. So it's a really neat process to be able to work with them. You work with the football ops side of things, and they care only about the football field, and then you work with the marketing and events team, and they don't care about the field, they care about everything else. So from our standpoint, it's a really neat perspective to be able to work with them to develop a strategy to become the best camp in the league.
Okay, very good. Any questions for Matt? Okay, very good. Matt, if you do me a favor, I think that young lady in the back is here probably for APC meeting. You might direct her to where she needs to go tonight.
I can do that.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Okay, John, Cam, any additional business for go to the order?
None?
None.
Nothing? Okay. Any other items from the commission members?
I just have one comment.
I'm sorry.
I just want to wish everybody a Merry Christmas and
Thank you, Bob.
hope you get opportunities to spend time with your families.
Well, that's a good one.
You know,
Yeah. It's
Back at it next year, I guess.
Yep, we'll be back at it. We've got our calendar laid out, so we will see you at the January meeting. Thank you, Bob. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year all, Happy Hanukkah.
Thank you.
Happy holidays.
Meetings
Happy holidays.
All of them.
Are we adjourned?
Hey, Linda, was I reading that right? There's an NOL of about 300 grand for the Colts camp? No, on the Colts camp.